The ink on the land deed was barely dry when Isaac Langston realized that among the cattle grazing rights, the water access clauses, and the mineral exclusions, someone had written his future wife's name. He stood in the dim light of Harlan Gentry's study on the evening of September the 4th, 1873, holding a document that smelled of pipe smoke and old ambition, and he read the final clause 3 times because he was certain his eyes were failing him. The words did not change. In exchange for the full and uncontested transfer of the eastern parcel of the Gentry land holdings, including all water rights to Redstone Creek and grazing access through the autumn months, Isaac Langston of Langston Ranch would take Clara Gentry, age 22, as his lawful wife, said marriage to be completed within 30 days of the signing of this agreement. Isaac set the document on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a man who was working very hard not to say something he could not take back. Harlan Gentry, who was 61 and going soft around the jaw, leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands over his middle. He was a man who had spent 40 years turning everything around him into a transaction, and he had the satisfied look of someone who had just executed a particularly clever one. "It is a fair deal," Harlan said, as if fairness was something he had recently learned to perform. "The land is worth a great deal. Clara is a good girl, obedient, knows how to manage a household." Isaac looked at the older man for a long moment. He was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes the color of creek water in the shade. He had ridden from Colorado to New Mexico territory to settle his father's disputed land, and he had expected negotiations to be complicated. He had not expected them to include a person. "Where is she?" Isaac asked. Harlan blinked. "Clara." "Yes, Clara, the woman you just included in a property deed." Harlan's expression flickered toward something uncomfortable before settling back into business. "She is upstairs. She knows about the arrangement. She is agreeable." Isaac had been in enough negotiations to know that agreeable, when said by a man about a woman under his roof, meant very little. He picked up the pen that was offered to him, and then he set it back down. "I need to speak with her first," Isaac said. Harlan's brow creased. "That is not customary." "No," Isaac agreed, "and neither is writing a woman into a land deed. Humor me." There was a long silence in which Harlan studied Isaac the way he might study weather on the horizon, trying to determine if it was going to cost him anything. Finally, he stood and called to the woman who appeared in the doorway almost immediately, suggesting she had been very close by. She was not what Isaac had expected. He was not entirely sure what he had expected, but Clara Gentry stood in the doorway of her father's study with her chin level and her dark eyes steady, wearing a plain calico dress the color of sage, and she looked at the land deed on the desk, and then at Isaac with an expression that was neither meek nor hostile. It was the expression of someone who was paying very careful attention. "Miss Gentry," Isaac said, "my name is Isaac Langston. I believe your father has outlined an arrangement to you." "He has," she said. Her voice was even, controlled, the kind of controlled that took effort. "I would like to speak with you privately." Harlan started to object. Isaac looked at him with a calm and absolute patience that stopped the older man mid-breath. Something in Isaac's expression said clearly that this was not a request. They stood on the front porch in the cooling September air, the last light going gold and orange over the mesa to the west. The Gentry Ranch was a proper establishment, with a wide house and a bunkhouse and a barn, and Isaac could see why his father had spent years arguing over where exactly the property line fell. It was good land. Good water, the kind of thing men built legacies from. Clara Gentry stood with her arms crossed loosely over her chest and waited. "I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly," Isaac said. "I generally prefer honesty," she said. "Do you want this, the arrangement your father has put together?" She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods at the edge of the yard, and somewhere out in the dark the cattle shifted. "No," she said finally, "but I did not believe I had a choice." Isaac nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. He looked out at the mesa and thought about the land deed inside, and the woman standing beside him, and the very specific kind of man her father was. "You have a choice," he said. "I am not going to hold you to something you did not agree to." Clara turned to look at him then, and for the first time her composure cracked just slightly, enough for him to see the relief and the wariness mixed together underneath it. "My father will not release the land without it," she said carefully. "Then your father and I will renegotiate," Isaac said. "But I am not signing a document that includes a human being as part of a property settlement. That is not something I am willing to do." Clara studied him. She had a way of looking at a person that was thorough without being unkind, the way a sensible person checks the ground before they step onto it. "You came a long way for that land," she said. "I did," he agreed. "But there are things I can live without and things I cannot." He went back inside. Clara remained on the porch for a moment longer, breathing in the cool night air, and she felt something shift in the region of her chest that she could not quite name yet. The renegotiation with Harlan Gentry was not pleasant. It lasted the better part of 2 hours and involved a great deal of table pounding on Harlan's part and a great deal of quiet, immovable patience on Isaac's. By the time it was finished, Isaac had agreed to pay a higher price in cash for the water rights, had conceded 2 grazing seasons instead of 3, and had walked away with a deed that contained nothing but land. He was given a room for the night because it was too dark to ride out in Harlan for all his faults, maintained a certain code of ranch hospitality. The room was clean and spare, with a narrow bed and a wash basin, and Isaac lay on top of the quilt with his boots off and stared at the ceiling and thought about the woman down the hall. He thought about the way she had said no and the steadiness with which she had said it. He thought about the relief in her face when he told her she had a choice. He thought about agreeable and what that word cost a person to perform. In the morning he rose before the sun, dressed, and went to the kitchen because he always woke early and the smell of coffee was already in the air. Clara was there. She was standing at the iron stove in the early dark, feeding wood into the firebox, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway without any surprise, as if she had known he would be an early riser. "Coffee is almost ready," she said. "Thank you," he said, and he sat at the long kitchen table and watched her move around the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who had run this kitchen for years. He accepted the new terms, she asked, setting a heavy mug in front of him. "He did," Isaac said. "The land transfers next week." She nodded and poured her own cup and sat across from him. The kitchen was warm from the stove and the first gray light was beginning to show in the window above the sink. Outside, the roosters were starting. "I owe you an explanation," Clara said, surprising him. "You do not owe me anything," he said. "I think I do." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I was not going to fight it. Last night before you arrived, I had decided to simply accept it. I want you to understand that I am not someone who gives up easily, but I did not see a way forward and so I had stopped looking for one." Isaac looked at her. "What changed?" "You walked in and asked me what I wanted," she said simply. "No one has done that in a very long time." The morning light was growing slowly in the kitchen window, and Isaac felt something quiet and significant happening in the room, the way a river changes direction deep underground before anyone on the surface knows it. "I would like to ask you something else," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "Not this morning," he said. "I mean in general. I would like to write to you if you are willing. Get to know you the proper way." Clara considered him for a long moment over the rim of her coffee mug. "You are asking me," she said. "Yes," he said, "properly." And something in her face went warm and open in a way that was entirely different from the controlled steadiness of the night before. It was the expression of a person who has been thirsty for a long time and has just been handed water. "Then yes," Clara Gentry said. "I would like that." He rode out that morning with the signed deed and a piece of paper on which Clara had written her address in the careful, slanted hand of a woman who had been educated and who took her education seriously. He did not look back at the house until he was a quarter-mile down the trail, and when he did, she was standing on the porch with her coffee cup, watching him go, and the morning sun was behind her, and she was lit up gold around the edges like something out of a painting. He thought about that particular image for the next 6 weeks more than he thought about anything else. The letters began the third day after he returned to the Langston ranch, which sat 37 miles northwest of the Gentry property, close enough to be neighbors in the vast geography of New Mexico territory, and far enough that a morning's ride separated them. Isaac was not a man who found writing easy, but he found that writing to Clara Gentry was different from writing in general, because with Clara Gentry, he had the sense that honesty was not only accepted but expected, and honesty had always come more naturally to him than performance. He wrote about the ranch, about the way the high desert turned colors in October, the way the pinon trees smelled after rain, the way his foreman Dilas Pacheco could predict weather 3 days out by the color of the clouds over the Sangre de Cristo range, and had never once been wrong. He wrote about his father, who had died the previous winter and left him the ranch and the disputed land claim, and a leather-bound Bible with notes in the margins that Isaac had read 3 times. He wrote about growing up in Colorado, about learning to ride before he could read, about the particular quality of silence that the western landscape has that no other place on earth seems to replicate. Clara wrote back. Her letters were wonderful. They were precise and observant and occasionally very funny, and they surprised him every time. She wrote about the ranch from the inside, the way she had managed the household accounts since she was 16 because her father could not be trusted with figures, the way she had learned to read weather and grass conditions from the old vaquero on the property, Miguel, who had been born on that land before the territory changed hands and who knew every spring, every draw, every hidden corner of it. She wrote about her mother, who had died of fever when Clara was 14, and about the particular loneliness of growing up in a house full of men who did not know what to do with a girl who asked questions. She wrote about reading. She had a small shelf of books in her room, and she described them to him with the kind of affection people usually reserve for old friends. She wrote about wanting to see more of the territory, about wanting to understand the world beyond the boundaries of her father's ranch. She wrote with a directness and a warmth that made Isaac realize, very quickly, that he was not simply exchanging courteous letters with a woman he might someday possibly consider. He was already falling. The 4th letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, and Isaac read it sitting on the top rail of the corral fence while his horse worked in the paddock below him, and when he finished he read it again. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, which was where all of Clara's letters ended up, pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. Dilas Pacheco leaned against the fence post beside him and said nothing for a while. Dilas was 54 and had spent his entire life in this territory, and he had the particular wisdom of a man who has watched a great many things happen and has learned which of them require comment. "The Gentry woman," Dilas said finally. "Her name is Clara," Isaac said. Said Dilas, and he was quiet again for a moment. "You are going to ride over there." "I am considering it," Isaac said. "You have been considering it for 3 weeks," Dilas said. "Your horse is rested, the south fence is mended. There is nothing here that cannot wait until Monday." Isaac looked at the sky. It was a clear Friday. The light was the particular sharp, clean light of high desert autumn, and the air smelled of pine and cold stone and the distant sweetness of dry grass. He rode out the next morning at first light. It was a 4-hour ride at an easy pace, and the land was spectacular the whole way, the kind of landscape that made a man feel small and grateful in equal measure. He crossed 2 dry creek beds and climbed through a stretch of pinon forest and came down into the Gentry Valley just before noon, when the sun was directly overhead and casting no shadows. Clara saw him coming from the yard. She had been splitting kindling, which was not the kind of work he expected to find her doing, though he realized very quickly that he should not have been surprised. She was wearing a canvas work apron over her dress, and her hair was escaping its pins in a way that suggested she had been at it for a while. She did not look embarrassed. She set down the axe and walked to meet him at the gate, and she said, "You could have written that you were coming." "I could have," he agreed, swinging down from the saddle, "but I was not entirely sure I was coming until I was already on the road." She looked at him for a moment with that thorough, careful look of hers, and then a smile broke across her face that he had not seen before. It was a real smile, not the polite, managed one she had offered in the doorway of her father's study. It reached her eyes and changed the whole shape of her face and did something very specific to his breathing. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." They sat at the same kitchen table, the same two chairs, the same morning light coming through the window even though it was noon, and they talked for 4 hours without stopping. It was different from the letters, better and worse at the same time. Better because he could see her face and hear her laugh and watch the way she gestured when she was making a point she felt strongly about. And worse because sitting across from her was making it very clear to him how much he did not want to ride back to his ranch alone. Harlan Gentry appeared at the kitchen doorway around the 2-hour mark and looked at Isaac with a complicated expression that was equal parts assessment and resentment, and something that might have been grudging recognition. He nodded, said very little, and disappeared. Clara watched him go with the patient tolerance of a woman who had long since decided her father was what he was. "He is not entirely without redeeming qualities," Clara said. "I will take your word for it," Isaac said, and she laughed. He rode out before supper because propriety demanded it, but he asked if he could come again the following weekend, and she said yes, and the fact that she said it without any pause or calculation meant more to him than she probably knew. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. By November, the rides were two-way. Clara appeared at the Langston ranch on a Thursday afternoon in early November, riding alone on a good bay mare, with a bundle of fresh-baked bread wrapped in cloth tied to her saddle, because she had made too much, and it seemed wasteful to let it go to nothing. She looked entirely comfortable on horseback and entirely comfortable arriving unannounced, and Isaac, who was in the middle of helping Delos repair a section of collapsed corral rail, looked up and found her and felt a kind of joy that was simple and uncomplicated and new to him. Delos Pacheco looked at Clara Gentry on her bay mare with her bread bundle and her easy seat in the saddle, and then looked at Isaac with an expression that said everything and nothing. "I will finish the rail," Delos said. "I can help you finish it first," Isaac said. "Go," Delos said, and walked away. Isaac showed Clara the ranch that afternoon. It was not as established as the Gentry property, which had 40 years of investment behind it. The Langston ranch was newer, still building itself, and Isaac talked about what it was and what he wanted it to become with the kind of honest ambition that Clara found more compelling than any polished presentation could have been. He showed her the well he had dug in August, the new barn framing, the small kitchen garden that had not produced much its first year but that he had plans for. "What would you plant?" she asked, looking at the turned-over earth. "I am not sure I have the knowledge for it," he said. "I grew up around cattle. My mother kept a kitchen garden, but I was always more interested in what was happening in the corral. Tomatoes first," she said immediately. "They are the most rewarding, then beans because they give back to the soil, squash along the south fence where the sun is good, and herbs closest to the kitchen door so you do not have to go far." He looked at her. She was looking at his kitchen garden with the expression of someone who was already planning it, and something about the scene, about the way she was standing in the cold November light seeing what could be in a patch of churned dirt, made Isaac understand that what he was feeling was not infatuation or convenience or even simple loneliness. He was in love with Clara Gentry. The understanding settled into him like water into dry ground, quietly and completely, and he stood there in the cold afternoon with the knowledge of it, and he thought about the land deed and the study and the man who had tried to include her in a property transaction, and he felt a gratitude so fierce it almost hurt, because that negotiation had given him her address, and her address had given him her letters, and her letters had brought him here. He did not say any of this to her that afternoon because the afternoon was too new, and he had not yet figured out how to say it. But De Los Pacheco, who ate supper with them that evening and watched Isaac watch Clara across the table, said to Isaac afterward, when Clara had ridden home in the early dark, "You should not wait too long." "I know," Isaac said. "She is not the kind of woman who will wait forever," De Los said, not unkindly. "And she should not have to." "I know that too," Isaac said, and he said it with the weight of someone who had been carrying the knowledge around for a while and was starting to understand what to do with it. The winter came down hard in December of 1873. Snow hit the high country first, as it always did, and came down into the valley in a series of storms that kept the roads uncertain and made the 37 miles between the two ranches feel like a great deal more. The letters continued. They were more frequent now, and they had changed in character, become more open, less careful, as if the cold weather had melted some final layer of reserve, and they had both decided to stop being precise and start being real. Clara wrote about a dream she had had, about standing in a field of wildflowers that went on to the horizon and not feeling afraid of how far it went, and about waking up and feeling strange because she had never thought of vastness as a comfort before. Isaac wrote about the way the ranch felt at night in the snow, the way the animals in the barn made the whole building warm, the way De Los played guitar some evenings when the work was done and the music went out into the cold, clear air. He wrote about wanting her to hear it. She wrote back that she would very much like to. In January, a blizzard kept Isaac from riding out for 2 weeks. He sent letters by way of his ranch hand. A young man named Tommy Bright, who was 20 and cheerful and had very good instincts for navigation. And Tommy made the ride to the Gentry Ranch 3 times in 2 weeks because Isaac found he could not go without knowing how she was. On the 3rd trip, Tommy came back with a letter and also with a small wrapped parcel, inside which was a wool scarf in dark green, very carefully knitted. Tommy reported that Miss Gentry had mentioned she had noticed Isaac's neck was not covered when he rode in cold weather, and that this seemed like a correctable problem. Isaac wore the scarf for the rest of January and most of February. De Los said nothing about it, which was its own kind of commentary. The January cold broke toward the end of the month, and Isaac rode out on the first clear road and arrived at the Gentry Ranch on a morning that was cold and brilliantly blue. Clara came out to meet him in the yard, and the scarf around his neck was the first thing she saw, and she smiled in a way that was quietly pleased and a little shy, and entirely unlike her usual composure. And Isaac thought he might have to get off his horse a moment early because his knees had gone briefly unreliable. They walked that morning, something new between them, down through the Gentry land toward the creek that would be running again when the snow melt came. The ground was frozen and the cottonwoods were bare and the sky was enormous and empty and blue. "I need to tell you something," Isaac said. "All right," Clara said. "I am going to say it poorly," he said. "I am better at letters." "Then say it poorly," she said, and there was a gentleness in her voice that was different from her usual directness, like she had opened a door that she did not usually leave open. "I came to this territory to settle a land claim," he said, looking out at the frozen creek rather than at her, because it was easier to say things without watching her face. "I expected it to be a legal and financial process. I expected to handle it and go back to managing cattle. I did not expect to ride away with your address in my pocket and spend the next 4 months thinking about your letters and your laugh and the way you look at things." He stopped, and then he made himself look at her. "I am in love with you, Clara. I have been for a while. I wanted you to know." Clara Gentry stood in the frozen cottonwoods on a January morning and looked at Isaac Langston, and her face went through several things in quick succession: surprise and something unguarded and something very warm and something that looked, for just a moment, like the relief of a person who has been hoping for something and has just been told it is real. "You are better at letters," she said. He laughed, startled into it. "But I understood you anyway," she said. "And I am in love with you too. I have been for a while." They stood there in the bare cottonwoods for a moment with the vast blue sky above them and the frozen ground beneath them, and the weight of what they had just said hanging in the cold air between them like breath. And then Isaac reached out and took her hand, which was cold through her glove, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and they stood like that for a long time without saying anything else because nothing else was required. The walk back to the house was different from the walk out. Clara leaned into him slightly as they walked, not much, just enough for him to feel her warmth against his arm, and when they got to the porch she looked up at him with a question in her face. He kissed her. It was quiet and cold-cheeked and brief, because the yard was visible from the house and Harlan Gentry was somewhere inside. But it was very real and it changed everything all over again. February brought with it a problem that Isaac had been half expecting and had hoped to avoid. Harlan Gentry was not a man who accepted that his plans had been voided, without looking for another way to arrive at the same destination. The land settlement had not happened, but Harlan had spent 40 years in this territory making deals, and he understood leverage. He understood that Isaac Langston was spending a great deal of time on his property, and that his daughter's feelings were visible to anyone who looked. He arrived at the Langston Ranch on a cold February morning without invitation, which was not how things were done, and Isaac met him at the gate with the polite wariness of someone who had expected something but not quite this. Harlan dismounted and stood with his reins in his hands and said, with the bluntness of a man who had decided to skip to the end, "What are your intentions toward my daughter?" Isaac looked at him. "That is a conversation I intend to have with Clara first," he said, "and then with you." Harlan's jaw worked. "She is under my roof and my authority. She is a grown woman," Isaac said, 22 years old, capable and intelligent. "I will speak with her first." Harlan studied him for a long moment, the assessment of one hard man looking at another, trying to determine where the weak places were. He did not find any. He gave a short nod that was grudging respect dressed up as dismissal, mounted, and rode back. Delos appeared beside Isaac a moment later. "I thought he might draw on you," Delos said. "He thought about it," Isaac said. Then he thought about it some more and decided against it. "You need to talk to her soon," Delos said. "I know," Isaac said. He rode out that Sunday. The morning was overcast and smelled of coming weather, the specific gray-soft smell of snow building in the clouds. Clara was in the barn doing something practical with a horse blanket and a fraying buckle, and she looked up when he came in out of the cold. She knew immediately from his face that he had something to say. She set down the blanket and waited. Isaac took off his hat and held it by the brim in both hands, which was not something he usually did, and he looked at her in the dim light of the barn with the horses moving quietly in their stalls and the smell of hay and cold and leather all around them. "Your father came to see me," he said. Her expression tightened. "I am sorry. He had no right to do that without telling me." "It is all right," Isaac said. It clarified some things. He turned his hat once in his hands. "Clara, I have been thinking about how to do this properly, and I have been going back and forth about timing and circumstance, and whether I should wait another month or whether waiting is just a way of being afraid, and I have concluded that it is the second thing." Clara was very still. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of land or settlement or anything your father ever had in his head about arranging things. Because I have spent the last 4 months finding out who you are and I want to spend the rest of my life doing it." He stopped. "I am asking you properly. No documents, no deeds, no negotiated terms, just asking." The barn was quiet for a long moment. One of the horses stamped. The wind moved against the outside walls. Clara put down the buckle she had still been holding in one hand. She crossed the space between them and she put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and she looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "Isaac, yes." He put his arms around her and she put her face against his collar, and they stood in the barn in the cold February light and held each other. And it was not dramatic or theatrical, but it was entirely real, the kind of real that holds, the kind that does not have to perform itself. "I would like a say in the wedding," she said after a while. her voice muffled slightly against his coat. "You can have all the say," he said. She pulled back and looked at him with shining eyes and that real smile, the one that reached all the way up. "Good, because I have some ideas." The conversation with Harlan was shorter and less fraught than Isaac had expected, possibly because Harlan had already burned through his bluster on the February visit and had nothing left for this occasion. He sat behind his desk and listened while Isaac said what he had to say, which was that he intended to marry Clara, that Clara had agreed, that he was coming to Harlan as a courtesy and as a matter of proper form and not because he required the man's permission, that Clara was 22 and her own person and had made her own choice. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is better than this ranch, you know, better than most of what I gave her." Isaac was surprised, not by the content of what he said but by the plainness of it, as if Harlan had decided to tell the truth about one thing and chose that thing. "I know," Isaac said. Harlan nodded. "See that you remember it," he said, and that was the end of the interview. They were married in April of 1874. The spring had come in gently that year, which felt like a gift the territory had decided to offer on the occasion. The wildflowers were out across the mesa, the kind of extravagant late April bloom that only happens when the winter has been hard enough to need it. The pinon trees were bright with new growth. The creek was running full and clear from the snow melt, exactly as Clara had predicted it would be when she stood beside it in January. The wedding was held at the small chapel in the town of Cuesta, 8 miles from the Langston ranch, a whitewashed adobe building with a wooden cross above the door, and a minister named Reverend Albuquerque, who had been in the territory for 15 years, and who married people with a plain, genuine sincerity that Clara had specifically requested. She had attended enough performative ceremonies to know what she did not want. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from ivory muslin with small pearl buttons down the back, and a spray of dried wildflowers worked into the fabric at the waist, and she carried a small bouquet of the same wildflowers that were blooming outside. She had dressed her own hair, dark and shining, pinned up with a few loose pieces framing her face, and when she came through the chapel door on the arm of a ranch hand because she had asked her father to come as a guest rather than as the man who gave her away, Isaac looked at her from the front of the chapel and felt his chest do something complicated and enormous. She was 22 years old, clear-eyed and radiant and entirely herself, and she was walking toward him. De Los Pacheco stood beside Isaac as his witness and said nothing, because De Los understood that this was not a moment for commentary. The ceremony was simple and direct, as Clara had wanted it. They said the words and meant them in the way that words are only worth the meaning behind them, and when Isaac put the ring on Clara's finger, a plain gold band he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe, he held her hand for a moment longer than the ceremony required, and she looked up at him, and everything in the world was very quiet. The wedding supper was held at the Langston ranch, which Clara had already begun to think of as home in the weeks of preparation leading up to the wedding. De Los had arranged a long table in the yard, and the ranch hands and a few neighbors from the surrounding land had come, and there was roast meat and fresh bread, and a cake that the woman from the next ranch over, a kind, capable woman named Eugenia Marsh, had made as a gift. Tommy Bright, who was young and easily moved by occasions, wept during the ceremony and then denied it with great conviction at the supper table. Harlan Gentry sat at the far end of the table and ate quietly and drank less than usual and watched his daughter laugh at something Isaac said. And if his expression was complicated, no one thought it necessary to examine it too closely. The stars came out over the Langston ranch that April night in the uncountable thousands that the high desert sky produces when the conditions are right, and Isaac and Clara sat together on the porch long after the guests had gone or found their beds, Clara leaning against Isaac's side with his arm around her, and the night sounds of the ranch all around them. "I am happy," Clara said. It was not a complicated statement, but it was a significant one. It was the statement of someone who had not always been able to say it. "So am I," Isaac said. They sat there until the cold drove them inside. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that is both ordinary and miraculous, which is what the best years are. There was nothing dramatic about most of it. It was the accumulation of small true things, the way Clara reorganized the pantry in her first week, and Isaac came in to find everything in better order than it had ever been, and she looked at him a little sideways expecting criticism, and he said, "This is much better than what I had," and she relaxed like a sail filling with wind. The way Isaac came in from riding in foul weather one November evening and Clara had a meal ready and dry clothes set out by the stove. And neither of them made much of it because they had learned very quickly that small domestic kindnesses were the actual architecture of a shared life. Clara planted the kitchen garden in May as she had planned, tomatoes and beans and squash along the south fence and herbs by the door. And by July, it was producing more than the two of them and Delos and Tommy could eat. And she began putting up preserves with the kind of methodical satisfaction that Isaac found quietly wonderful to watch. She also, in her spare hours, began keeping a set of account books for the ranch. Not because Isaac asked her to, but because she looked at his record-keeping one afternoon and determined it could be done better, and she was right. Within 3 months, she had organized the finances of the Langston ranch with a clarity and efficiency that Isaac had never managed on his own, and he told her so, and she accepted the acknowledgement with the directness of someone who does not need to be falsely modest about a real skill. Isaac was a good rancher and a better husband than he knew. He was steady and honest, and he listened when she talked, truly listened, which was not as common as it should have been. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions and held her answers in genuine regard. When the fence question came up in June, whether to run new fence along the north boundary or to repair the old one, he laid out both cases to her one evening after supper, and she thought about it for a day and came back with a third option he had not considered, which was to start with the north corner and work east in stages, which would cost less and spread the labor across 2 seasons. They ran the fence her way. It worked. Delos Pacheco, who had been on the Langston ranch before Isaac inherited it, and who had a vaquero's particular kind of loyalty to the land, and the people who managed it well, had decided within the first month that Clara Gentry Langston was exactly what the ranch had needed. He did not say this out loud. He expressed it by teaching her everything he knew about water rights and grass management, and the particular behavior of cattle in different seasons, and Clara absorbed all of it with the same attention she brought to everything. In the evening sometimes, when the work was done and the supper was over, and the sky outside the windows was purple and vast, Delos played guitar, and Isaac had kept his promise, and Clara sat and listened with her mending or her book on her lap, and the music went out into the high desert air just as Isaac had described in his letters. And she thought sometimes about the letter, and about the woman she had been when she read it, trying to believe that things might be different than they had always been. And she looked up at her husband across the room, and felt a gratitude so large she could not fit it in words. In the summer of 1874, a situation developed with a neighboring rancher named Cord Devereaux that required Isaac's patience and Clara's considerable intelligence in roughly equal measure. Devereaux was a man who had arrived in the territory 2 years prior with money from somewhere east and ambitions that were not always confined to legitimate means. He had purchased the parcel on the western edge of the Langston Range, and he had a way of running his cattle that tested the boundaries of everyone around him, not violently but persistently, the way water tests stone. His cattle began showing up on Langston grazing land in August. At first Isaac had his hands drive them back without comment. When it happened a third time, Isaac rode over to Devereaux's ranch himself and had a civil conversation about fencing responsibility. Devereaux was charming and apologetic, and the cattle were back on Langston grass within the week. "He is not careless," Clara said, when Isaac came home from the second conversation frustrated. "He is testing to see how far you will push back." "I know that," Isaac said. "Then push back with documentation," she said. "Write down every incident. Date, location, number of cattle, condition of the fence line. If there is ever a legal question, you want paper." Isaac looked at her. "You are very good at this. I grew up watching my father make deals," she said. "I learned what worked and what did not. Documentation works." She helped him set up the record log herself, and it became a habit with Tommy, who rode the boundary lines twice a week and reported what he found. By October, they had 3 months of clear, dated, consistent records. Devereaux received a letter, written by Clara and signed by Isaac, that was completely polite and entirely unambiguous. It listed the incidents. It described the legal position. It expressed confidence that the matter could be resolved without further escalation. Devereaux's cattle stopped appearing on Langston grass. Devereaux himself, when he passed Isaac in town the following spring, nodded with the grudging respect of a man who has run his test and found the thing he was testing sturdier than he expected. Clara received this result with the satisfaction of a person who has done a piece of work well. "You should have been a lawyer," Isaac told her. "The territory does not allow women to practice law," she said. "It should," he said. She smiled at him with her real smile. "Yes," she said, "it should." The winter of 1874 into 75 was cold, but not as brutal as the previous one, and the ranch ran well through it. Clara had organized the winter stores in October with a thoroughness that meant they never ran short. Isaac had added a new section to the barn in August, built with Delos and Tommy and 2 men hired from town, and the additional space meant the livestock were better sheltered. It was during that winter, in the long, quiet evenings, that Isaac began talking to Clara about expanding the ranch. Not wildly, not recklessly, but with the considered ambition of a man who could see what was possible and wanted to build toward it. He wanted to run more cattle, and to do it in a way that maintained the land rather than exhausting it, which was something Delos had impressed upon him, and which Clara understood from her years of watching how the gentry land was managed and mismanaged. They talked about it the way they talked about everything, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with coffee cooling between them, going back and forth with ideas and questions, until they arrived at something that felt right. Clara had a particular gift for identifying the weak point in a plan, not to discourage but to strengthen, and Isaac had learned to present his ideas to her not for approval but for examination, and the difference between those two things was everything. By February, they had a plan. They would add 40 head to the spring purchase, graze them on the North Range which had been undergrazed the previous year, and rotate the old stock to the east pasture, where the grass was already recovering from the winter. They would hire a second full-time hand in March. They would approach the question of the additional water rights from Redstone Creek that Isaac had conceded in the original gentry negotiation, this time approaching Harlan directly and paying fair market value. The water rights negotiation with Harlan went better than expected, partly because Harlan had mellowed somewhat since the wedding and partly because Clara came with Isaac, and Harlan Gentry still found it easier to be reasonable in his daughter's presence. They arrived at a fair number by midday and signed papers by afternoon, and on the ride home Clara sat straight in her saddle in the February cold and watched the land going by and thought about what it meant to have a future that was genuinely hers, built of her own choices, tended by her own hands. "You are very quiet," Isaac said. "I am very happy," she said, which was the most efficient way she could find to describe the complex internal weather of that moment. He reached across between their horses and found her gloved hand and held it for a moment, and they rode the rest of the way home like that where the trail was wide enough, and when it narrowed, he let go but she felt the warmth of it for the rest of the ride. In March of 1875, De Los Pacheco announced with no particular ceremony that he was planning to visit his sister in Las Cruces for a month. This was a journey he made every several years, and the ranch ran on the understanding that Tommy and the new hand, a solid, quiet young man from Arizona named Porter Hins, would manage the day-to-day in his absence. Clara stood on the porch and watched Delos ride out and felt an unexpected tenderness, because Delos had been a constant at the Langston ranch, and she had come to think of him as the kind of person whose absence changes the quality of a place. "He will be back in April," Isaac said, coming up behind her. "I know," she said. "I just have not spent much time thinking about how much this place would change without him." "It would change a great deal," Isaac said, "but it would not fall apart. He has made sure of that." She leaned back against him, and he put his arms around her from behind, and they stood on the porch looking out at the ranch in the early spring light. "Isaac," she said. He said, "I am going to have a child," she said, the moment stretched. "Clara," he said, and his voice did something she had not heard in it before, something wide and almost disbelieving. She turned in his arms to look at him. His face was a thing she would remember all her life, the expression on it in that moment, open as the sky. "You are certain," he said. "As certain as one can be," she said. "I have known for 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure." He held her face in both hands very gently, and looked at her with an expression that contained more than he would ever be able to say out loud. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I feel very well," she said, which was mostly true. The mornings were difficult, but she felt fundamentally well in the way she had been feeling for a year and a half now, the steady, warm wellness of a person who is in the right place. The baby came in November of 1875, when the weather had just begun its turn and the first frosts were coming at night. It was a boy, which surprised Clara only in the way that any baby surprises you by being specifically itself. He was healthy and loud, and had Isaac's dark curly hair from the first moment, which Clara noted with the slightly tired humor of a woman who has just been through a long ordeal. They named him Thomas Henry Langston, Thomas for Tommy Bright, who had driven through a late October storm to fetch the midwife from Cuesta, and had done it without being asked, just arriving at the house with his coat soaked through, and saying he thought the time might be close, and he had gone to get Mrs. Ramirez, because he was not going to sit around doing nothing. Henry for Isaac's father, who had bought the land with his own labor and left it to his son. Delos Pacheco held the baby on the 3rd day with the careful, uncertain arms of a man who does not have much experience with infants and who is afraid of breaking something small and important, and he looked at Thomas Henry's small, creased face for a long time. "Well," Delos said finally, "he is going to be trouble." "Why do you say that?" Clara asked. "Because they always are," Delos said, and there was something in his voice that was absolutely fond. Isaac Langston, in the months following Thomas's birth, became a man who stopped in the middle of tasks he had done 100 times before because a baby was doing something in the next room, and he needed to go see what it was. Clara observed this phenomenon with quiet amusement and deep affection. She had wondered, in the way women sometimes wonder even when they trust a man entirely, what kind of father he would be. She had her answer. He was the kind who sang. Not well, but consistently and with conviction. Every night in Thomas's room while the baby moved between sleep and waking, Isaac sang in a low, quiet voice the songs his mother had sung to him. Old Southern songs and hymns and 1 or 2 cowboy songs that he had learned from Delos, and that Delos, if he heard them, would probably have said Isaac was mangling past recognition. Thomas did not seem to mind. Clara would sit in the rocking chair in the corner of the room on the nights she was not too tired, which were more nights than Isaac suggested she ought to push herself, and she would watch her husband pace slowly with their son against his shoulder, and she would think about the land deed in Harlan Gentry's study in September of 1873, and about the ink that had been barely dry, and about the look on Isaac's face when he put the pen down and asked to speak with her. She thought about the porch in the cooling night air. She thought about the first cup of coffee in the kitchen, very early, before anyone else was awake. She thought about how differently everything might have turned out, and the thought produced in her a complicated warmth that was part gratitude and part fierce protectiveness, and part the simple, astonishing recognition that choices matter, that the right one at the right moment can change everything. Harlan Gentry came to see his grandson in December. He arrived with a wooden toy horse he had carved himself, which no one who knew Harlan had realized he was capable of. He held Thomas stiffly at first, and then with the gradual relaxation of someone remembering something they had done before and had believed they had forgotten. Clara sat across from her father at the kitchen table and watched him look at her son, and she found that the complicated feeling she had always carried about Harlan had shifted slightly, not resolved into simplicity, because he was not a simple man and she was not going to pretend otherwise, but it had settled into something she could live with. He had made decisions that were wrong and she had paid for some of them, and he had also carved a wooden horse in his workshop and ridden 8 miles in December cold to bring it. People, she had decided, were more than one thing. This was generally inconvenient, but it was the truth. The spring of 1876 brought changes and opportunities to the Langston Ranch in such a cluster that it felt sometimes as though the territory was making up for its earlier scarcity. The cattle herd had grown well from the previous year's additions. The North Range was producing as Clara had predicted it would. Porter Hins turned out to be not just a solid hand, but a genuinely excellent stockman with an instinct for cattle health that saved them from a disease problem in April that could have taken a significant portion of the herd. They hired 2 more hands and built a new bunkhouse to accommodate the growth. Clara supervised the construction of a proper kitchen addition to the main house, the original room being somewhat small for the daily reality of feeding a working ranch household, and the new kitchen had a second window and a pantry with shelving that she had designed herself, and which everyone who used it agreed was very well thought out. Delas said, as he examined the new pantry shelving, "You should have been an architect." "The territory does not let women be architects either," Clara said. Delas said, and said no more, but the expression on his face was the particular one he wore when something pleased him. Isaac had begun to take on a different kind of reputation in the territory during this period. Not a loud reputation, nothing that required a fast draw or a hard fist, but the quieter kind that comes from being known as a man who deals honestly and maintains his land well and whose word is what he says it is. He had been approached twice about serving on the County Land Commission, and after the second approach he talked to Clara about it. "It is a lot of additional time," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It is also the kind of thing that shapes how the territory manages itself for the next 20 years. Someone is going to do it. The question is whether that someone thinks about it the way you do." He looked at her across the kitchen table. Thomas was asleep in the next room. The spring evening was coming in blue and soft through the windows. "You think I should do it," he said. "I think you would be very good at it," she said. "And I think you have a particular understanding of what it means to have land used as a bargaining piece when it should not be, and that is not nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "You mean your father?" "I mean anyone who treats land, or the people attached to it, as a transaction," she said. "That is going to keep happening in this territory for a long time. Someone on the commission who understands why it should not is worth having." He joined the Land Commission in June. It added 2 days a month to his obligations and a significant amount of correspondence to his desk, but Clara handled most of the correspondence with his direction, which was an arrangement that worked because she was better at it and they both knew it. The summer of 1876 was long and clear and productive. Clara's kitchen garden was twice what it had been the previous year, and she had added a proper herb garden along the south wall of the house that smelled extraordinary on warm evenings. Tommy Bright, who had become genuinely part of the Langston household family without any particular ceremony, had taken on the responsibility of the kitchen garden as his particular domain under Clara's supervision, and tended it with the same diligent enthusiasm he brought to everything. Thomas Langston, who had been a loud, emphatic baby and had become a loud, emphatic toddler, spent most of that summer following Delas Pacheco around the ranch with the unshakable loyalty of a duckling. Delas accepted this arrangement with his customary minimal expression, and taught Thomas the name of every horse in the barn and the proper way to hold a lead rope before the boy could form complete sentences, which struck Clara as exactly right. In the evenings of that summer, Isaac and Clara developed a habit that became the ritual of their life together for the years following. After supper, after Thomas was down, they sat on the porch together in the late light, sometimes talking and sometimes not, sometimes with books, sometimes with the day's correspondence, sometimes just watching the light go off the mesa. The high desert evenings in summer were spectacular, the kind of sky that makes you feel you have been given something you did not earn. They talked about everything during those evenings, about the ranch and the land and the territory and the commission decisions, and what the next 10 years might look like, and what they wanted to build. About Thomas, who was showing every indication of being an exceptionally determined child, which was probably inevitable given both of his parents. About the letters they had written each other in the first months, which they had kept, both of them, every single one, in a cedar box that sat on the shelf above the bedroom fireplace. "Do you ever read them?" Isaac asked her one evening. "Sometimes," she said, "when I want to remember the beginning." "The beginning was a land deed with your name in it," he said. "No," she said. "The beginning was a man who put a pen down." He looked at her. "The beginning was you asking me what I wanted," she said. "That was when it started. Everything before that was just circumstances." He was quiet for a moment, and then he took her hand the way he had on the frozen creek bank in January of the year they met, and he held it. "I am very glad I asked," he said. "So am I," she said. The years that followed the summer of 1876 were years of growth and deepening, the kind of years that settle into each other with the comfortable weight of a life being lived fully. The Langston Ranch expanded twice more, each expansion discussed and planned with the same careful deliberateness that had characterized the beginning. Clara's kitchen garden had grown into a substantial produce operation that provided for the whole household and traded the surplus to neighboring ranches, an arrangement that Clara had initiated and managed, and that brought in a modest but real additional income. Thomas, who turned 5 in November of 1880, was already showing an interest in horses that suggested his grandfather's ghost was somewhere in the mix, though Delos would have taken credit more readily, given that he had spent 5 years teaching the boy every word he knew about horses before Thomas could adequately write his own name. Clara taught him to read herself, sitting at the kitchen table every morning with a worn primer and a patience that was thoroughgoing and cheerful. Thomas learned quickly, which gratified Clara, and then used the skill immediately to read about horses, which amused Isaac enormously. "He is his grandfather's grandson," Isaac said. "He is his own person," Clara said, which was her standard answer to any suggestion of determinism, and which Isaac had learned was always true. In the spring of 1881, Delos Pacheco announced in his usual minimal way that his back was giving him trouble, and that he was going to be moving to his sister's house in Las Cruces by fall. He said it at supper one evening in May as if he were announcing a change in the weather, and the table went very quiet. Clara, who had known this was coming for a year because she had been watching Delos favor his right side, and had heard him in the early mornings moving more carefully than he used to, set down her fork and looked at him. "You will come back for the fall roundup," she said. "Not to work, to be here." Delos looked at her with his steady dark eyes. "If you want me," he said. "You know we want you," Isaac said. Delos ate his supper in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I taught that boy everything worth knowing." He nodded at Thomas, who was eating with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who does not want to miss anything happening at the adult table. "He will be fine." "He will come and visit you," Clara said. "We all will," Delos said, which was his most complete agreement. He left in September as he had said he would. Isaac and Clara and Thomas rode with him to the road, and Thomas held Delos's hand when he said goodbye with the grave seriousness of a child who understands that some goodbyes are a kind of change. Dilas mounted, and he looked at them for a long moment without speaking, and then he said to Clara, "You made this into a real place." She looked at him steadily. "We all did," she said. He rode south, and they watched him go until the dust settled, and then they rode home together in the autumn afternoon with Thomas between them on his small pony, and Clara felt the weight and the rightness of the years all at once, like standing on the summit of something, and being able to see all the way back to where you started. Porter Hins took on the foreman's role in Dilas's absence with a competence that honored the position, and the ranch moved into the decade of the 1880s with the steady confidence of an operation that has been built on honest ground. In October of 1882, Clara gave birth to their second child. This one was a girl, and she came into the world as emphatic about it as Thomas had been, which suggested she had learned something in the womb about how things were done in the Langston household. They named her Margaret Rose, Margaret for the grandmother Thomas barely remembered, and Rose because Clara had always loved the word and thought a girl deserved a name that was a little extravagant. Isaac held Margaret on the evening of her first day and sat in the rocking chair in the room where he had once paced with Thomas and sung the songs his mother taught him, and Clara watched from the doorway as he sang them again, his voice the same low, quiet, unspectacular instrument it had always been, and Margaret listened with the fierce, startled attention of someone encountering music for the first time. Thomas came and stood beside his mother in the doorway and looked at his father and his new sister. "She is very small," he said. "You are very small too," Clara told him. Thomas considered this with the dignity of a 7-year-old who finds it difficult to believe he was ever small. "Will she ride?" he asked. "Eventually," Clara said. "I will teach her," Thomas said, with a proprietary certainty that was so precisely Dilas Pacheco's influence that Clara had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. The years moved. The Langston ranch continued to grow, not extravagantly but solidly, season by season, with the reliable expansion of a thing built on honest work and good sense. Thomas Langston became a young man of remarkable character, steady and curious, and deeply connected to the land in the way that only people who have grown up on it ever are, and he took over more of the day-to-day ranch operations as he entered his teenage years, not because he was pushed to, but because it was genuinely what he loved. Margaret Rose Langston became, as anyone who had known either of her parents could have predicted, entirely herself. She was direct and funny and ferociously intelligent, and she read everything she could find, which in the New Mexico territory of the 1880s was not as much as she wanted, but was more than most people expected a rancher's daughter to care about. Clara drove 40 miles twice a year to Santa Fe to bring back books, and Margaret worked through them at a rate that necessitated the trips. Harlan Gentry died in the winter of 1884, in his bed in the house where Clara had grown up, with the wooden horse he had carved for Thomas on the bedside table. Clara went to see him in the last weeks and sat with him in the evenings when he could still talk, and what they said to each other in those hours was between them and the firelight. But she came home from the final visit with a settled look that Isaac recognized as the particular look of someone who has finished an old piece of unfinished business and can now set it down. The Gentry ranch passed to Clara, since there were no other heirs and Harlan had changed his will the year after the wedding, a fact Clara had not known until the lawyer read it aloud. She and Isaac discussed what to do with it for a long time, sitting at their kitchen table in the way they had always worked through the large questions. In the end, they combined the land operations under one management, with a separate set of hands based at the Gentry property and a clear accounting kept, and the combined range became one of the more significant ranch operations in that part of the territory. Clara did not feel triumphant about inheriting her father's land. She felt the weight of it, the complexity of it, the old stories inside it. She honored it by managing it well. Miguel, the old vaquero who had been born on the Gentry land before the territory changed hands, was still there in the bunkhouse, 70-some years old, and not writing much anymore but perfectly clear in his mind. He had taught Clara everything she knew about the land's water and grass, and she went to see him the week after the estate was settled, and they sat outside in the winter sun, and she told him that nothing was going to change for him, that he had a place there for the rest of his life if he wanted it. Miguel looked at her with old eyes that had seen a great many things done well and badly in this territory. "Your father should have asked you," he said, "before he put your name in that paper." "He should have," Clara agreed. "Things worked out anyway." "Because of you," Miguel said. "Because of a man who put a pen down," she said, which was what she always said and which was true. On a September evening in 1887, 14 years after Isaac Langston had stood in Harlan Gentry's study and read a land deed that contained a person's name and had set the pen down on the desk without signing it, Isaac and Clara sat on their porch as they did every evening when the weather allowed, and the mesa to the west was going through its Octoberly colors, which had come ahead of schedule this year. A sweep of amber and burnt orange and the deep blue-green of the pinon pines below the rock. Thomas was 21 and doing a horse trade in town and would be back by dark. Margaret, who was 5 and entirely sure of herself, had been put to bed 30 minutes ago and was almost certainly still awake and reading by the lamp that Clara had told her to extinguish, but had decided, as she often decided with Margaret, that the reading was worth the small deception. Clara was 41. She had lines at the corners of her eyes that had been put there by years of sun and laughter, and the specific expressions she made when she was thinking hard. Her dark hair had a few gray strands in it that she had decided she had no reason to be troubled by. She was wearing a blue shawl that Margaret had given her for her birthday, and holding a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold while she was watching the light on the mesa. Isaac was 43. He was broader through the shoulders than he had been in 1873, and his hair had a few threads of gray at the temples, and he had the look of a man who had been in the sun and the wind and the weather of this country for 20-some years, and had been made by it rather than worn by it. He was reading a land commission document with the slightly resigned expression of a man who has been on the commission for 11 years, and still finds the way some people think about land to be genuinely baffling. "There is a proposal," he said, setting the document down, "to consolidate the grazing rights in the Southern Valley under a single lease arrangement that would effectively lock out any rancher below a certain acreage." "Who benefits?" Clara asked, without looking away from the mesa. "3 of the largest operations in the county," he said, "and Cord Devero." "Of course," she said. "I am going to write a dissenting position," he said. "Good," she said. "I will help you draft it in the morning." They were quiet for a while. The light was leaving the sky in the way it does in the high desert, dramatically and all at once, the orange going to violet, going to the deep blue that precedes dark. "Clara," Isaac said, she said, "do you ever think about how different this might have been?" She looked at him. "Which part?" "The beginning, if I had signed that document." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the fading light. "I think about it occasionally," she said. "Not with fear anymore, more the way you think about the road you did not take, gratitude that you went the other way." "I almost signed it," he said. "I want you to know that I had the pen in my hand." "I know," she said. "I was watching from the doorway." He looked at her. "I did not know that." "I wanted to see what he would do," she said. "Whether you would just sign it." She was quiet a moment. "You put the pen down before you even looked up, before you knew I was there." Isaac sat with this for a moment. "It was never about the land," he said. "No," she said. "It never was." She reached across and put her hand over his, warm and familiar and entirely right. The hand she had held in frozen cottonwoods and in the barn in winter light, and on the morning of their wedding, and on 1,000 ordinary Tuesday evenings since. "You asked me what I wanted," she said, "and then you asked me properly. Everything else followed from that." The stars were coming out over the Langston ranch, uncountable and brilliant, the high desert sky doing what it always did, opening itself up into something so vast it made everything beneath it feel simultaneously very small and entirely significant. Inside the house, Margaret was almost certainly still reading. The horse trade in town was almost certainly going in Thomas's favor, because Thomas Langston had inherited his mother's instinct for the moment when a deal could be better, and his father's patience for waiting for it. The cedar box on the bedroom shelf held every letter, all of them, the whole careful, honest record of a beginning. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the season, but the herbs by the door had a few late-season leaves still worth picking, and in the morning Clara would do that, and the soup she was planning for tomorrow would be the better for it. The new fence along the north boundary, which Thomas had supervised the building of in August, was solid. The ranch books showed the kind of numbers that represented not just money but years of honest work and good decisions, and the particular faith that comes from deciding to build something real. De Las Pacheco, in his sister's house in Las Cruces, had sent a letter last month saying his back was tolerably well, and that Thomas's last visit had done him a great deal of good, and that Margaret was going to be trouble, which was his most complete expression of admiration. Porter Hins ran the daily operations of the Langston Ranch with a competence that had only improved over the years, and next spring his son would be old enough to start as a hand, which was a kind of continuity that pleased everyone. Tommy Bright, who was 34 now and had married a woman from Cuesta named Dolers 2 years ago, was doing well and had his own small claim further north, and came back to help with roundup every fall because that was the kind of man he was. Miguel, who was somewhere near 80 and still at the Gentry property, had written in October that the water table in the eastern draw was doing something interesting, and that someone should look at it in spring, and Clara had written back that she would come look at it herself and bring Thomas so he could learn what Miguel knew while Miguel was still there to teach it. The Land Commission document would get its dissenting position, well argued and carefully sourced, and 2 of the 3 commission members who had been uncertain would read it and change their votes, and the consolidation proposal would fail, and the small ranchers of the Southern Valley would continue to run their operations in the way that the territory was supposed to work. The wooden horse that Harlan Gentry had carved was on a shelf in Margaret's room now, because she had asked for it, having been told its story. All of it was real and all of it was theirs, and all of it had grown from a September evening in 1873, when a man had held a pen over a document and put it down and gone to the porch, and asked a woman what she wanted. On the porch in the September dark, with the stars enormous and close overhead, and the sounds of the ranch settling into the night around them, Clara leaned her head against Isaac's shoulder and felt the warmth of him and the steadiness of him and the specific gravity of a life built with someone who had chosen you and had kept choosing you every day since. "I am very happy," she said. She always said it this way, with the weight behind it of someone who knew precisely what it cost to arrive at that sentence. "So am I," he said, and they sat there together in the high desert dark, the 2 of them, on the porch of the ranch they had built, until the cold came in from the north and drove them inside to their life.